And good afternoon, everybody. Steve Schmidt with the warning here, and pleased to be able to bring with you today for conversation Anne Applebaum from Warsaw. And welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So we were just talking for a moment before people started joining about how unprecedented what we are seeing form in the United States. And this has happened, this has been made law. And so when we look at Trump's perversely named Big Beautiful Bill as a propaganda package, it's so gigantic, so immense. It was unfathomable in scale and size and cost and damage. One part of it that was stopped was the public land sell off. And that's an interesting going forward detail and learning from how you stop Trump, because that's the only area where they were stopped cold. But this bill, it adds so much to the debt if you care about fiscal issues. It demolishes indiscriminately and without much thought the social safety net. It is corrupt with regard to the tax code, inverting it very much into a regressive code, greatest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top in American history. Rural health care will be decimated by this. There will be massive amounts of hospital closures, a lessening of access, but all of those things, not very long from now and forevermore, as bad as they are, this bill will be remembered, I think, for a singular thing. This bill, without much debate, without any great speeches of denunciation and dissent that will linger in the congressional record, this funded a federal police force which has never existed in the United States. It is, by I think any reasonable definition, and you are a sober, serious person, and you can correct me if I'm wrong if it doesn't meet the definition of a secret police force, given that these people are masked, they are badgeless. The totality of this is a budget that would put it in the first rank of global militaries, comparable, depending on how you count the money, to the French military and nuclear power, with aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, expeditionary capabilities. The sector lead was being interviewed, ICE, in uniform, full combat kit, in front of an armored vehicle. And he said, and I'm quoting very close, but not precisely, he doesn't work for Karen Bass. He doesn't care what she says or the people in California say. He's with the federal government, and the federal government is there to stay, and that's the new normal. And yesterday, the new normal was 5 armored vehicles in the middle of the day, tactical plan codenamed Operation Excalibur, supported by the U.S. Army Federalized Forces. And they invaded MacArthur Park, and the ops orders talk about the threat assessment, that this is the place where MS-13 came to life and they should expect to be in combat. And there's assessments about the civilian casualties in the elementary schools next door to it. And it is all madness, of course. But I don't think your average American has a handle yet on how transformative this legislation will be and the amount of money. And when I talk about transformation, Here are the transformative pieces of legislation in the last 80 years. You had the GI Bill, you had Medicare and Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and you had the Interstate Highway Act. Those were the most transformative pieces of changing the, the landscape, the complexion of the country until this. And so, how do you think about the constitution of a federal police force that is now the largest law enforcement entity in the United States? Every single person who made a speech 24 years ago warning about the Homeland Security Department has been proven to be prophetic. How do you see this?
So you are right to point to this as the thing in the bill that has the greatest possibility to do the most long-term damage to democracy and to freedom in the United States. What worries me about it is you've named as well, is that it's the first time I've seen how the Trump administration could get around the problem of divided power in the United States. So in the U.S., we have checks and balances. We all know the courts and Congress are supposed to check the president and so on. But there's always been an additional layer of check of restraint on the federal government, and that additional layer has been the power of states. That actually a lot of our laws are made locally or at the state level. State governors are very powerful in our political system. That's quite different, by the way, from a lot of European countries where there aren't local entities with that kind of power and control. And so, any attempt to create a national program or do nationwide arrests on any kind of large scale was always going to be stopped at the state level. And it's I mean one of the reasons I suspect why it's never been tried. What worries me the most about this ICE police force, whatever it's going to be called, is that it seems to be designed to overcome that. As you say, it's a force that, at least so far as it's been used, it's people who are dressed like military combatants, carrying military grade weapons. Many of them have had their faces masked, so we don't know who they are. They are going into residential neighborhoods where they are carrying out mass arrests of some kind. For the moment, I suppose most Americans are telling themselves, well, it's directed at illegal immigrants, so I'm safe. Um, but once you have a force like that in place, what's to stop you from using it in other ways against other kinds of people? And we've already seen people being accidentally arrested, people who are citizens or who have a right to remain in the United States. We've seen them already be arrested. We've seen this force, use violence against ordinary people who are simply standing in their way. And once that begins to happen, what worries me is this feeling of, people will get used to it. They'll become accustomed to it. They'll stop seeing it as unusual or strange. They'll begin to assume that it's normal that the federal government should have that kind of power and be able to wield that kind of violence. Um, and then they'll begin to make excuses, so, okay, it's only illegal immigrants. All right, it's only people who violated the law in some way. Or it's only people who've come up, who've deserved it. They've done something bad to the president or to the federal government, or they're protesting in some illegal way. I mean, this is something that we know from history. There's a kind of mission creep that you get when you have that kind of power, when you have that kind of government power. And that's what worries me the most about this police force, whatever it's gonna be called. I suppose the other thing that worries me is there were actually people making speeches about it. Hakeem Jeffries had that long soliloquy in Congress, and I've heard other Democrats, other members of Congress have spoken both about this ICE and about the bill and the damage the bill is going to do in a lot of places. What to me is disturbing is how many is Republicans, senators, and congressmen who are going along with this, even though they clearly know what it is. And they clearly know that it's wrong. People have made fun of Lisa Murkowski because she's a senator who has seemed to understand the dangers inherent in the bill, and she took a trade-off supposedly because of some deal about Alaska, and she decided to vote for it. But actually, look at the rest of them. I mean, all of everybody who voted for it is responsible for changing the nature of the relationship between the states and the federal government. Everybody who voted for it is responsible for the cuts to health care for poor and poor working people. It's not just people who are unemployed, it's people who work and don't make a lot of money. They're all responsible for it. And they have said remarkably little. Even people, think of someone like Ted Cruz or somebody, um, uh, you know, somebody who there are people who've made great drama in their careers about defending states' rights and defending the rights of Americans, and have seemed to be advocates of free speech or sticklers for the Constitution, and you saw them all cave. And I have to say, even though I wrote a book about this, I wrote a book called Twilight of Democracy, which was about why people are attracted to authoritarianism. I wrote a cover story in The Atlantic a few years ago that was about collaboration and collusion. So I've thought about this subject a lot. And I've written history books that touch on it. And I still don't get it. Like, I still don't see why, if you're a Republican senator, someone who has an enormous amount of power and 100 people working for you and a lot of job security, you get elected for 6 years. I still don't understand why you have to vote for something like this. And I look forward to hearing more people explain it to me.
Tom Tillis is a perfect example of this. And there's nothing that brings me closer to public aneurysm than when I hear a version of what he said, which is, well, I just haven't had the freedom to vote the way I wanted. And, I've had to do this, but now I'm going to retire. So now I'm finally free. And I sit there and I think, huh? You're a United States senator. You can do whatever you want. And where does that come from?
I can, as I said, I've tried to explain it. Some of it is a desire to be part of the movement. They feel this movement of history, or they think they feel it, and they want to be part of it. They don't want to stand apart from it. Some of it may be in the case, and this is very sad in our country. Some of it may be personal fear. They are. We now know that people. If you're a senator and you vote the wrong way and you go home to your state, you'll have people threatening you or your family. And we know this, among other things, from Mitt Romney's autobiography, or his biography, sorry, it was written by my colleague, where Romney describes talking to colleagues in the Senate who say, well, it's all very well for you, Mitt, you're rich, you can afford security and I can't. And so there's that aspect to it. A lot of them, I think, and Lindsey Graham is a great example, but there are others. A lot of them tell themselves a story about how, if I stay in this system, if I remain on the inside, I can be influential. If I remain in the movement, I can talk to Trump. I can get some things out of him. I can get something done. So there's a that kind of story people have told, which is not at all different from the kinds of stories people told themselves in occupied France, or indeed communist occupied Poland. If I remain in the party, if I can do some good. There's that version. Most people don't like to think of themselves as being bad people, so they'll have an explanation for it. So it's that combination of fear and and as I said, this feeling that the crowd is moving and I need to stay in the crowd. But as I said, I can give you these explanations, and I can point you to earlier moments in history when people made excuses like that, and I can quote you from them. And you know, great book by Czesław Miłosz called "Captive Mind," which is about exactly this phenomenon in communist Poland in the 1940s. But even then, I look at people in the U.S. Senate. As I said, these are many cases, these are wealthy people. They have They have enormous support. They've been elected from their states. They have huge staffs. They don't have the nerve to push back against any of this, or even to go through the bill and say, do we need this measure? Do we need that measure? To work in groups to change it. I mean, it's even, as I said, even though I can give you rational explanations, it's still hard to understand.
You I'm not trying to quibble with something you said, but you used a tense that hit me, and I wanna talk about it. You said the Republicans in the Senate who are going along with this. When are we across the line where they have fully gone along with all of it? And so I ask you this question about where that boundary is, because the second thing I want to talk to you about is and just foreshadow the question is you and I um came out of I think fair to say the right of center line as it existed in American politics, and every person, most every person, like all of them, right? Not 90%, right? Not 99%, right? And there is an infinitesimally small number of people, Adam Kitzinger, uh, Liz Cheney, Anne Applebaum, Steve Schmidt, small, small number of people who've operated at very high levels in the American government, in the Republican Party, in the political establishment, who did not get in line with this. And so for us, and I think you have to be careful about judging people, the voters. There's too much judgment of the voters who got conned and had a bad choice. But I have a lot of judgment towards a lot of these people because we all were supposed to believe in the same thing, and we were all in the same places, in the same meetings, where we were in a business that required belief until it became completely hollow in an instant. And as somebody who grew up in New Jersey, that the person who rose to the top of the political cult of personality that threatens the republic as Donald Trump is just another layer of icing of farcical absurdism, right on top of tragedy, on top of tragedy, on top of what I don't know. But I I don't get a chance to talk to a lot of people, right, who are in that space, but literally every person, right, that in that political space that we've known said Lindsey Graham. I spent an enormous amount of time with Lindsey Graham, with John McCain in a presidential campaign, lived with him for a year and a half. Um, and how do you feel about that? Do you ever feel lonely about it? Do you do you ever, because you have certainly held the line about what it is that you said it is that you believe in, and it's a very lonely place.
I suppose, I mean, I'm lucky I'm not in the US all the time. I have a wide range of friends. I was not in politics the way you were in politics. I'm a writer and a historian and a journalist rather than you know, a person who works on campaigns. Um, but I did have a period of realizing that I would have to make new friends. I mean, and literally I'm often asked, this phenomenon that we're describing, which is sometimes called polarization, as people split apart and a part of the political spectrum becomes radical, and it includes your former friends. I have had a lot of conversations with people in other countries who've had this, and they ask me for advice. what do I do? And my advice always, I think maybe it sounds superficial, but I say make new friends. And so you know, in my case, it all started a little bit earlier. It's a longer story, but um, I began looking for new friends and new contacts, and I realized that the world that I'd lived in for a long time wasn't the same. It had, in my case, divided in multiple countries in very bitter ways, and I found people who aligned with me, um, and I moved on, and so I can't really say I feel lonely. I mean, I actually feel surrounded by a lot of people who agree with me. And it's interesting. Some of them, are people like you who come from the right or who worked in the Republican Party or worked on the Polish right or worked on, were part of the British Tory Party. Some of them come from there. And some of them came from what used to be the left, people who I would have disagreed with about all kinds of things, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I might not have spoken to, or I would have thought they were wrong, or they were on the wrong side of something that I thought was important. But what I found over the last several years is that there are these set of fundamental values that matter more than whether you think taxes should be high or low, or whether what's your opinion on how healthcare should be structured. I mean, there's some things that are much more basic. And I found that those basic beliefs, I find people who have them um, in different parts of the political spectrum, and those are now my friends or my colleagues, or my acquaintances. And so, no, actually, I didn't feel lonely. I feel like there are a lot of people, again, not just Americans, but a lot of Europeans also who see the same kind of threat, this threat of extremism, the threat of autocracy taking over their political systems, and they've joined together to try and think about what to do about it. So that's how I feel. But um, again, I wasn't in the same world that you were in.
W- Adolf Hitler in 1930 hits his high water mark, 38% of the vote. 32, the Nazis are around 30%. They have been kept out of government. Violence explodes all over the country. Hitler is made chancellor. There's one other Nazi in the German cabinet, and then in that fall of 32, Hitler gives this speech in Dusseldorf to the industrialists, which loosely was the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce, and he basically concedes. I know I'm not very popular here, but you don't have anything to worry about with me. Um, the communists, on the other hand, will kill all of you. And really, he lays out this proposition to the broad middle of Germany and these institutions that don't like the Nazis. You have the German aristocracy. You have the German military, which
Yeah, the
is
army.
it's comprised a lot of aristocrats. You have the German clergy, and you've had a total collapse of the center. And I think this is where Germany and the United States, and we don't really talk about this very often, but American soldiers who fought in World War II came to understand the country that was most like America was Germany. And that to this day, we have more Germans than any other population in the United States by ethnic heritage. And Germany was never a country that was susceptible to a dictatorship of the left. But a dictatorship and the threat of the left was enough to create a fascist government. And in the United States, right, what Trump has benefited from is the stigmatization of the Democrats, some of the extreme policies, being able to define them as extreme, being able to define them as left. Trump loves that a democratic socialist has won in New York. He would love to run against a democratic socialist in the general election. I don't think a socialist candidate could ever be elected in the United States. I didn't think they was ever conceivable for them to take power in Germany almost 100 years ago. But the threat or perception, the propaganda that they could is enough to create the fear that, hey, and the fundamental message of the Nazis was, we're going to kill them. We're not going to kill you. They're going to kill you. And there's a lot of that that's inherent in the Trumpian message. What does a centrist Democrat, the tradition of a John Kennedy, what does somebody have to step up and say to really get your attention in this moment where you're like, wow, that person just hit the nail on the head. What they said was what was needed to be said in the context of this, because I don't hear it really anywhere, at
So
least for me.
first of all, there is a really important difference. So actually, in at the time of the Hitler takeover of Nazi Germany, there had been a communist revolution in Munich, and there had also been a genuine Bolshevik revolution in Russia, which was throughout, in 1920, actually launched a war and tried to invade Poland, and it was like a real threat. There really were communists, and they were totalitarians, and they were, you know, bloody and warmongering. And so when Hitler said that, he wasn't. I mean, there was something real that people were genuinely afraid of.
For sure.
The weird thing about the United States right now is there is no equivalent of the Bolsheviks in the United States. There is no, bloody tyrants who are about to invade America. When we talk about democratic socialists in the United States, we're talking about people who believe in things like universal health care, which is I'm talking to you right now in Poland, which is, I mean, universal health care it would be untouchable. I mean, nobody, and even the Polish far right, doesn't want to dismantle it. You're and even when I hear the candidate to be mayor of New York, being vilified because he wants rent control. I mean, I think, okay, maybe rent control is a dumb policy, and maybe it's a bad idea to have, the city own grocery stores. Okay, like those are silly ideas, but they're not like. He's not talking about bringing in the Bolshevik hordes to wipe out the aristocracy or put people in gulags. So what Trump has successfully done, or partially successfully, is he's created this boogeyman about the left, which I think doesn't reflect anything like reality. I mean, and I've written critically about some left-wing extremist language, and there are many not smart people out there, and so on. But I just don't see that it's not like there's the equivalent of the Bolsheviks. He uses this language, and he talks about the radical Marxist left. You think Kamala Harris is a radical Marxist? Let me introduce you to some radical Marxists. Or Joe Biden. Joe Biden's not a radical Marxist, but they've created this sense of horror and fear and anger, out of nothing. I mean, that's one of the things that the internet can do for you. I mean, you can create almost entirely false narratives, and Trump has been a master of doing that. I mean, I do think that there are, they haven't all risen to the surface yet, and they haven't all, not all of them have full national attention. But it seems to me that there are actually a lot of centrist Democrats out there. I mean, there's Senator Murphy, there's Governor Pritzker, there's Pete Buttigieg, if you like him. There's Gavin Newsom, like him or don't like him. I mean, these are not people who are extreme leftists. And as I said, even the people who we call extreme leftists aren't, in any international standard, all that left wing either. But I mean, there seems to me there are a lot of moderate Democrats, probably most of the Democrats in Congress, most of them in the Senate, who stand for the values that I think most Americans still stand for. And they believe in the Bill of Rights, and they believe in separation of powers, and they believe in, they believe that there should be a safety net for the poor. By the way, the American safety net being much smaller and narrower than what you would find here in Europe. But this is, in a way, the oddity of Trump is, I mean, Hitler also arose in this atmosphere of terrible economic crisis and this horrific war, and there was runaway inflation, and there had been this decade of violence, and what have we had? We had, I mean, we had COVID, which may be a part of the explanation, but it's not like the United States is collapsing in economic disarray, or or we have 100% inflation, or we have anything like that. What Trump has done is created this sense of menace just in his language, and he's been allowed to do that by cowardly Republicans and people around him who've gone along with it.
So I think if I was to observe this and try to explain it to you under the scenario where you had just woken up from a coma after 10 years and here we are and have to bring you up to speed, is that Trump produces a television show
Mhm.
and he has a captive audience. He has a set. He has the White House. He goes other places, but mostly, we see Trump in a couple familiar poses answering questions. It's not ever really challenged, nor is he particularly effectively responded to. But this show, um, I mean, I suppose you could measure it, right? It's by the count of people who are watching cable news and all the proliferating elements. But I think there's huge parts of the population that have obviously tuned it all out, aren't affected by it. I remember being at my sister's place in New Hampshire, maybe 3 summers ago, when the television work was on, and I was trying to read something. And I just looked at her, I go, Jennifer, like, what are we watching? And it was a reality show, and about people who have disorders. And a woman was her compulsion. She was eating the stuffing of her couch. And I was like, what are we watching? Like, I turned it off. Right. And it's a version of that, right? But politics, which has become a forum for the mentally ill or undiagnosed psychiatric patients, right? Who found, many of them, their way into Congress or onto the staffs or into the pundit class. And in the totality of all of this, you can make an argument that, well, reality always finds a way of intruding, right? The suffering, right, comes and you can't bullshit your way through it. But what what is the way to wake up a people from a stupor, from a languor, from a apathy, as something's bearing down on them? Does history offer any lessons at intercession before things get worse and go into the abyss at this stage or at this cycle of government assertion of its power and authority that's arrested them? Are there examples of that?
Mhm. So, first of all, a lot of what Trump does, as you say, this reality show that he builds, a lot of it, I think, is designed to make people apathetic. Um, when you have this constant lying, and he lies, many times every day, and he lies about things that we all know he's lying. When the famous example was at the beginning of his first term, when he insisted that there had been more people in on the ellipse at the mall, when he was inaugurated, than there were, and he made his press spokesman lie about it, even though we all saw it on TV. And then, of course, the grotesque example is the election of 2020. So he lies constantly and repeatedly, and when that happens, you have the phenomenon of people saying, I don't know anymore what's true. This person says that, and this can't possibly be true. You get people checking out of politics because if there's no true, and you don't know what's true and what's false, then how can you believe in anything or care about it? And that's actually, I mean, that is a Putinist tactic. I mean, that is borrowed directly from what the Russians do in order to get people to deactivate them, to demotivate them, and demobilize them. You tell lies all the time. You change the narratives constantly, and you make people confused, and then they don't want any part of politics. And a lot of, actually, activism in Russia, at least until the war and until Alexei Navalny died, was about looking for ways to um, build a community around things that people knew were true. And in the case of Russia, that was about corruption. So Navalny was Alexei Navalny, who died in a prison camp, was an anti-corruption campaigner, and he built a kind of movement around making very high quality, sometimes funny videos about the money that had been stolen and relating it then directly to people's lives. So look, Putin stole this money and he built a palace, and that's why you have a crappy hospital and you have potholes in your road. So he constantly was trying to make this connection. But there are many examples of political movements in from countries around the world, including some that aren't quite the same as the U.S. and have different circumstances. But almost all of them need to begin with the understanding that the argument we're having in the United States isn't really the old kind of argument. So we're not really having an argument anymore about policy. It's not about Republican policies and American and Democratic policies. And, will taxes go up or down? Will we have this kind of infrastructure bill or that kind of infrastructure bill? We're now talking about, we now need to have politics be much more about defending institutions and defending very core values and explaining to people what's at stake. What's at stake is not whether, you'll have, $1,000 one way or the other to pay in tax. What's at stake is the way your country is going to be run, and finding a way to refocus politics on that is the beginning of the problem. But yeah, I mean, I may write something about this in due course, and coincidentally I taught a class at Johns Hopkins over the last semester with two colleagues, and the class was about resistance to dictatorship. And we looked at different movements in different countries. And of course, when we designed the class a year earlier, we were thinking about the United States. We were looking at, Mexico and Russia and, other countries. Beginning to think that way, beginning to think about where is the real argument and what is it about? I think that's the most important thing you can do to wake people up. And as I said, I do see Democratic politicians talking like that. I do see some of them trying to make those points. I don't think it's a wasteland out there with nobody saying anything. We also have this tendency, I don't know where it comes from, whenever anything is going wrong, to blame the Democrats as if it's their fault that the Republicans are destroying the Constitution. You know, th- Listen to some of them. Some of them are making sense.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's no question about it. But to me, what you point out is a political emergency and urgency. And as I listen to you, and as I hope the people who are with us listen to you, that they can appreciate how devastating the Democratic position was around Biden's fitness, his age, the gaslighting, because fundamentally, what happened? And there's a question the Democrats will have to answer running for president. They're going to be asked the question. The question is, what happened? And that's not a question about forensic investigation. It's about, will you tell the truth to me right now? And what happened is the Democratic Party lost to the most prolific liar in American history 2 elections on fundamental questions of honesty. And in this last one, it was honesty about the border, honesty about the economy, and honesty about Biden's fitness. And when you have a political party that loses an election to Donald Trump on questions of honesty, and this is the consequence of that loss is a very, very big deal. And that has to be talked about directly, honestly, and ruthlessly. And the fact of the matter is that whomever the Democratic nominee will be that can win a presidential election, they're going to be a break from the from the past and a break from having to defend some indefensible stuff. And, we talked about that mythology of the left. I mean, look, Kamala Harris, and I think everybody looks at this and evaluates it the wrong way. Do I think that Kamala Harris believes that federal prisoners should receive taxpayer funded sex reassignment surgery? I do not. Um, but why did she answer the question like that? And she answered the question like that and failed a massive character test. And you have a generation of Democratic candidates that have tried to appease some social media amorphous set of values and issues that have been exploited by a demagogue, by a fascist, by whatever it is you want to think about them to great, great, great effect. And the Democrats are going to have to offer a reform message and agenda and vision, I think, that pulls us into the future, um, and offers a pathway out of this. And that fundamentally, to me, starts with an ethics reform passage, ethics reform legislation, and then legislation that talks about how you really weaken the executive. But when you look at Republicans in this moment, MAGA politicians, it appears that they don't think they're ever not going to be in power again. And
That
I,
worries
I
me a lot.
find that to be very, very curious. Very curious that they don't seem to think that there's an election ahead, that they're underwater on the numbers.
I find that equally curious. I don't have um, I can't tell you that they're going to steal the election, or I don't want to be apocalyptic, but you're right. They aren't acting like people who are planning to lose. I mean, even I've said to a couple of people, I don't even really understand this drive to build huge amount of executive power, to give more and more power to the president, to make him a king, to deprive him, to make sure he's not blocked or by any courts or by anything. I mean, okay, what are they then going to be happy to give up that power to I don't know, President Ocasio-Cortez, or I don't know, President some other person whom they don't like? Are they willing to hand that power over to someone whose views are very different? Or even President Gavin Newsom? I don't know. Um, it does feel like they're doing something that they're not going to ever want to give up. And I don't have I'm not gonna lay out a scenario there, but it's an extremely odd way to behave. The point about our Constitution and the point about which, it has many flaws, but the point about it it was a set of rules that were possible for both parties to live with, more like, up until recent more or less. That you there was a set of rules, you played by the rules. When you won, you didn't change them, and that gave the other side the opportunity to compete for power once again. And when you lost, well, at least you knew that the person who won had some constraints on him. There was you were never ceding over total power to your political opponents. There was always some room for room for opposition and room for minority views and checks and balances and so on. If they're going to take away all the checks and balances, then we're entering a very different political world. And in that world, why would anybody ever want to give up power? It's too dangerous. If you give up power, then you can be arrested, or you can lose, or you can have your money taken away, or I mean, and that's what that's the um, that's the danger of what they're doing. Is they're making it too tempting to never want to for this Republican Party not to ever want to lose power.
I just saw someone on one of the comments saying Kamala had the election stolen from her, and that person's as crazy as any of the MAGA people. But right, I mean, what's the chances that you think? I mean, if the center, and I don't mean a center political position as a compromise between 2 points on a line. I mean, in
No,
the Tennyson sense, the center holding our values, our institutions, but a reciprocal extremism that answers Trump, I don't think will ever succeed. It will have a right wing
no,
dictatorship. We'll never have a left wing one in the United States, and so that would be crushed. And um, there you go. And as I read the comments, anytime you talk about the Democratic Party and what happened in 24, the fact that the National Party is a 27% approval level, people simply say, no, don't want to hear it. And as one of the people that walks with no um, hypocrisy on the subject, walking Dean Phillips out to make a principled stand, um, I think it's a huge problem. For Democrats, there is a deep intolerance on the left of people that just don't want to hear it, that are in a bubble, and there's a good party and an evil party. And the reality of it is that the American people can't stand hypocrisy, and they see a lot of it. They see it when Chuck Schumer goes out, and when U.S. Senator Menendez is arrested with the gold bars. He says, well, he's a great public servant for the people in New Jersey. And so all of that has poisoned trust. I don't know how you restore trust other than to tell the truth. And the idea that there is, the choice is the choice, and people didn't want the choice, right? 80% of the country saying we don't want the choice between these two guys, and the choice is what the Democrats gave. Their, campaign was supposedly a defense of democracy. There was no democratic, there was no democratic process for picking her, and it ended in disaster. And I think it was all predictable. And so when I objectively look at this, I think we have two elections, right? And we have two elections before the country is forever transformed. And so that the first ones are in 26. We're going to have an indication in 25 by the size of these victories in New Jersey and Virginia, what portends the Republican Congress. You're going to have stalemate for 2 years, and then you're going to have J.D. Vance is likely to be the Republican nominee, though it could be Tucker Carlson, or it could be Don Jr., right? Or it could be Marco Rubio. Um, but whatever, uh, it's a small list of known quantities there, and the next president's going to have to act with a lot of strength and then a lot of restraint to repair all of these institutions very quickly. And do you see anybody on the horizon who is saying things that inspire you, that person gets it? I'll give you an example. One for me is Jake Auchincloss. Right, Jake Auchincloss, member of Congress from Massachusetts, complete Marine Corps officer, completely understands the necessities of the moment. Is there anybody for you that's like speaking to you, that's resonating with you, the things you're saying? JB Pritzker says a lot of things that resonate with me.
Pritzker, Chris Murphy. I wrote a piece last year before the election about that a group of Democrats who had entered, most of them had entered Congress in 2018. And I really like and admire a lot of this is Abby Spanberger,
Mhm.
Mikey Sherrill, Jason Crow. Um, there's a, it seems to me there are quite a few people like that. They're not all at the very top level, but there are plenty of people in the party who seem to me to have, as you say, it's not about being centrist in the way of being halfway in between the left and the right. It's about people who very deeply believe in American values and who understand the importance of institutions and who want to defend and protect them. And I feel like I do hear that from enough people. The issue is presumably whether in a culture that values outrage and celebrity, partly because that's the way our media and social media are now constructed, can those people rise to the top? Can they, can a normal person, a normal, honest American who has had experience in the military or who has, who's thought deeply about policy, can someone like that still become president? That to me is the deeper question, because I do see people like that out there.
What's your gut tell you?
I think it's possible.
Yeah, like for me, right, like the idealism, right? It's tough for me to like, I can't, right? I just have that. There's a chord of American idealism in me that, right. And one thing that is true is that the country has produced the right people in the right moments, almost providentially out of nowhere. Um,
Lincoln. Mm.
Lincoln, well, Grant is an example of that. Sherman is an example of that. The three of them together, Dwight Eisenhower is an example of that. All of the World War II generals. And there are, people who deeply believe in the American faith, um,
Mhm.
that I don't think want to see it slip away and go gently into the night. I just say, we're talking about, these candidates of the future. Somebody just says, Obama, and it's the hour is over, right? And in fact, the World War II, post World War II era is over. Whatever we're going into, whatever we're going into now. Who speaks about freedom in a way that reminds you at any level of how John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan talked about freedom? Is there anybody who does that? And if not, why do you think that is?
I mean, once again, I mean, I'm not sure what you know w- what you mean by speaking about freedom. I mean, if you were to listen to Abby Spenberger, who doesn't have a huge national profile, I saw her speak at a backyard event in Northern Virginia, and she speaks. She would be someone who would speak about duty, about responsibility, about the need to defend values and the need to defend freedom. Um, I don't suppose she's she's not making speeches in front of the Berlin Wall yet. Um, but I would guess that in the Democratic Party, and that you would find a couple of dozen people who would be beginning to think along those lines. I don't know whether you've heard them all speak nationally yet, but they're there.
No, she's excellent, and I agree with you. Right, there are you can look at, probably I could, you probably go off 150 people, but it hasn't broken through in a way connected to the moment, and maybe it's just early in that.
I think it's early.
So I am I'm very frustrated by the lack of a response organized by the senators and by the members of Congress that highlight their most effective, their most funny members, right? That I think need to be engaged in the politics and the message of this moment to moment. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one thing that is for sure. There needs to be a vast coalition of Americans that stands opposed to this. Um, and I feel it. right? When I write that there's a demand, and you see some of it on the comments today, there's a demand that, for example, my positions conform, right, to their positions, right? And that's a function of an element of the Democratic Party, all right, that's just intolerant. And you see some of the comments on here about this all started with Ronald Reagan, right? There's a fetish about Ronald Reagan, who was elected in 1980, right? So it's 44 years ago. He left office with a 60% approval level after winning an election with 49 states. You're in Poland. I don't think Ronald Reagan has a reputation for dictatorship in Poland, but there's a lot of Americans who admire Ronald Reagan, who don't like Donald Trump, but probably don't like being screamed at about Ronald Reagan by someone in the opposing political party who needs their votes to win an election. And so, in a state like Texas, where a Democratic candidate hasn't won in 30 years in a statewide election, right? The cultural condemnation of, all this stuff, right, on a constant basis doesn't help, I don't think, right? Build that type of coalition. But so we have an audience, on this that's probably a left of center audience. What would you say about Ronald Reagan and about freedom? The last speech, I just saw a comment, Ronald Reagan was a crappy president. After 8 years, the last thing that Ronald Reagan talked about in his farewell address was the importance of immigration to the United States, and that the majesty of the country was that we were made up of all the peoples of the world, that it was our inherent strength. And so, like, his message on that subject would be something that you would think Democrats would want to embrace. But a lot of people don't want to ever, right, show any grace to anybody who's got that letter of an opposite party next to their name, right, in our tribal society. And if we can't get out of that, the country's done. And so I wonder on any given day, right? Like if we can get out of that. And I get depressed when I read the comments. It just shows, right, the keyboard warrior, the absence of grace, right? Really the ignorance of history, right? Any appreciation for who these guys are. And it's just really we got blue MAGA and you got Trump MAGA. And two MAGAs, right, in competition like scorpions in a bottle. That dynamic is a very, very depressing one for me.
It's a very oppressive dynamic, but I'm not sure that it reflects the entire country. I think most people are more nuanced. Social media has I mean, it's literally deliberately designed. It's set up to create polarization. That's what it does. You get more likes, you get more clicks, you get more popularity by having more extreme views, by embodying not a policy debate but an identity. What we now have is politics. It's not really about political. It's not about how our healthcare system should be structured, or what should we really do about immigrants. It's about having these identity groups that people click and feel part of. So, a part of the solution is finding people who can rise above that or move beyond that. And as I say, I've now said it, I think 4 times in the last 40 minutes. I think there are people who are trying. I do take your point about coalitions. I mean, one of the in the in the many conversations that I've had with people who have fought dictatorships in other countries, almost all of them talk about coalitions. And not just left-right coalitions, but thinking in terms of which parts of society are the ones who need to be moved. What's the best way to, and this doesn't apply so much to the United States, what's the best way to talk to the police or the military? How do you put together different audiences with different interests around a set of similar themes? And as I said, everybody who's ever been a successful opponent of a dictatorship has thought that way. Because what you need to do, as you rightly say, is move beyond just being really angry, even though anger is an important motivation, and begin to think more broadly. How do we bring people in? How do we build a movement? How do we work together? I mean, my instinct, and this I think it's reflected by polling, is that the majority of Americans are already uncomfortable with Trump. They're already uncomfortable with with the idea of an ICE police force that's larger than the Marines. They didn't like tariffs. They didn't like this foreign policy that moves back and forth and has no strategy. And so I don't think it's unthinkable that people could unite around common values and even and a positive vision for what the country should be, without arguing about whether Ronald Reagan was good or bad 40 years ago. I mean,
Right.
I,
I
I
think it's
think
crazy. I think it's
I think
crazy.
I think it's possible. And yeah, you're right. Here in Poland, Ronald Reagan is a hero, and there's actually a statue of him not that far
Right.
from where I'm sitting. But
There's a spot in Poland. This is the last thing I wanna ask you, but there's a moment coming, and I think it's gonna come before this midterm election where Pope Leo makes his inaugural visit to the United States. And I can't help but think that the College of Cardinals in their elevation of him, um, there's some synchronicity with the elevation of Karol Wojtyla, and to Pope John Paul II. And when Pope John Paul comes to Warsaw, a million Poles in the square, and that sign the cross there, and John Paul says to the assembled crowd in a quote that as much as any helped bring down the Berlin Wall, which is "Do not be afraid."
don't be
And
afraid.
not be afraid. And fear is such a element in all of this, purposeful, right? Never in our lifetimes have we seen a government purposefully invoke fear, spread fear, use anxiety, try to terrify people to augment its power, the illusions of its power. I just wanted to let you close out today, and thank you so much for joining me for the conversation. But just to talk about fear, right, as a tool and an element, and the recipes to fight back against fear, right? How do you stand up, right, against fear?
I've known so many people who have done really brave things, who have led movements or risked jail or gone to jail, in countries like Russia or Venezuela, or China. And almost all of them have the same thing in common. I mean, they have some ability to believe that in a some value that's greater than themselves. What happens to me doesn't matter. What matters is what happens to the country, what happens to my society. I mean, almost all of them are ultimately motivated. I mean, some of them actually, as in Poland in 1979, some of them are religiously motivated, but not necessarily. I mean, some are motivated by their belief and faith and hope for their country and their society. And so, you know, I would just urge people, to not just don't be afraid, but remember how piddling and silly the things that are being used to make you afraid are. You're being made afraid with rhetoric and games and junk you read online. It's important to rise above it and remember what's more important. You know, um, an insult that someone wrote to me, or a threat that someone said to me, or something that happened to me at my office, or what's more important is the way my society it functions, and the way my children are going to live, and what kind of country we'll be. So keep your mind on bigger things, and then you won't be afraid.
Um, just before I sign off, one of the things that Anne has talked about today is those rising voices. And just for the 3,000 people that are on with us, Abigail Spanberger running for governor of Virginia, going to be the governor of Virginia. Mikey Sherrill, Navy helicopter pilot, going to be the governor of New Jersey. Jocelyn Benson, another rising star in Michigan, Elise Slotkin, a important voice, Jason Crow in Colorado, Jamie Raskin, of course, indefatigable, Chris Murphy, the fighting Democrats, Jake Auchincloss. There are many, many more. There are going to be a lot of candidates who are getting into these races. And then there are the celebrity candidates, and they come always from the wings of the party, very rarely from the people that could appeal to the nation, right? Could appeal to a majority. And so what we could do today is appeal to you to inform yourselves about who those people are. Jake Auchincloss's Substack is called Easy. No, I'm sorry. It's called Simple, Not Easy. Please follow Anne Applebaum at The Atlantic on Substack, one of the foremost academics, thinkers, writers, and advocates for freedom in the world, an important voice and one who will be over the decade ahead as this fight, and it is a fight, rages on. And one of the things that is always true against any aggressive force, against any fascistic force, the aggressor always has that first mover advantage, and it's the side that supports freedom because is involved in enjoying their freedoms is usually slow to rise in defense of it, but rise in defense of it we have to do in this 250th anniversary year of the birth of the United States, an epochal event in the history of the world. And so we'll leave it there today. Thank you so much. Keep the faith, believe in your country, and understand things will get worse, but then they will get better. And that's the way it has always been. We are in a test, and we have to meet the test. Good afternoon, everybody.